Welcome to the Gold Client for BW demo. I'm going to be presenting today a quick overview of the Gold Client solution for BW. We're going to briefly hit on all of the options and all of the abilities that Gold Client for BW has. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more in-depth time in our data recast section. And later there will be other videos that you'll be able to watch that give more detail into some of our other parts of our Gold Client solution. I'm going to start right now with just showing you how to get into Gold Client for BW. It's as simple as a transaction code, zgold BW. So this launches the home screen. For those of you that are familiar with the Gold Client for ECC solution, this screen is going to look very similar, not exactly the same, because we're dealing with objects as opposed to tables and data flows, but it's going to feel very similar. And that's what we really want to try and do for our customers, is to make sure that when they're looking at our solution, that we have some uniformity across all of our offerings. The first thing I want to look at, and the first couple of things, are both going to be non-data specifically related. They are Query Complete and the Info Provider Equalizer. I'm going to start with the Query Complete. The Query Complete is our solution for being able to copy queries from typically a productive system into a lower level system in the cases where query development is done directly in production as opposed to being done in a development and transported up through the landscape. Some customers start in dev and move it all the way up, so this solution may not be quite as useful for them, although there can be some specific uses, especially if we're talking about like a sandbox or an environment outside of the transportable landscape. But typically this is going to be used by the customer that has all of their development done in production. There's some tests that they need to do in dev or in sandbox or QA, and they need a query, or they need a query that's the updated version of the query from production. And instead of either grabbing the query out of production and trying to transport it back through, or doing one screen of the production query, one screen of the QA query, and trying to make them match, our utility enables you to very quickly be able to move queries from system to system. So I'll show you real quick what that looks like, and then I'll go into more detail in another video. So we would simply select the info cube, data store object, multi-provider, or info object that we're interested in. So in this instance, I'm just going to choose a purchasing cube, and our source system, in this case, is going to be BWT. And I'm going to start by just hitting execute, and what it's going to do is it's going to bring up a list of the queries, comparing using an RFC connection between the two systems. The queries that are in either both systems and are showing as green, or queries that are only in the target system, and those are going to show up as red because they are not currently in my system that I'm running the copy query solution from. So if I wanted to add the new queries, I would select them, hit continue, and then they would bring those queries over. When we do that, it's not only going to bring the main structure of the query over, it's going to bring anything that's a part of that query, including calculated key figures, restricted key figures, variables. And if any of those pieces of the query do not currently exist, they will be recreated. And if they do exist, they're not going to be built again. Only if they're missing will they be created. So that you're not going to have a bunch of junk in your system of _1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's just going to do that once to bring in that updated calculated or restricted key figure, as the case may be. So I'm going to move on to the next one. The next non-data specific function is called our Info Provider Equalizer. And there are two parts to this function. The first one is our Compare Info Provider. And this is going to look very similar to our query copy. because it also uses an RFC connection to go between the two systems. And what we're doing in this instance is to determine are there differences in the structures of objects between the two systems. And we've got our selections here. It can be an info object, a cube, or a data store object. I'm just going to select a data store object, for example, here. Select a DSO. My source system, again, is going to be the BWT. And I'm going to hit execute. And so what it's going to do is, again, use that RFC connection to compare objects in the two separate systems, and to determine if there are differences or similarities between the systems. So currently, I see that these items are the same for type of data store object. The setting is the same number of key fields. However, when we get down to data fields, I see that my value that I'm looking at my BWT system has 3 additional fields that my BWD system does not have. It has these debcred, DCLC, and document currency. So we see that there are some differences. There's a couple of options to where we either may not care, may not matter if we're exporting data from a source into a target, and the target's got more fields. It will still work. That export will still work fine. It will just leave blanks for those 3 fields in the transformation. They won't connect to anything, and they'll just come through as a blank value when we export the data out from our source system. The other option is we could go into, let's say this is a sandbox system we're comparing to. We could go into that system and update it, or if it's production, maybe wait for the transport in order to have all those fields so we can fill them in the correct way. Or we've got another option, which is the other part of our info provider equalizer, which is a line info provider. And so what this does is it allows us to go in and either on an individual object basis or a group of objects be able to update or add objects that may or may not exist in your target system. And so if we wanted to, for that particular object, we went back to the data store, and again I hit the source system. If I executed this, what it would do is it would rebuild that DSO object to match what my source system was currently. So this is I found this very useful in a couple of places. The main one, though, is when we're looking at like a sandbox system where we want to do prototyping, and we will have a group of maybe, let's say 5 cubes that have varying degrees of similarity between what's in production or maybe what's in dev, and we would like to do some prototyping for a new project, and we'd like those cubes to match, let's say, production. And so we would go into that source system. We point this tool back at our production system, and it would determine what are those structures of the cubes, bring it down into our sandbox system, and it would rebuild those cubes according to what the production key fields and settings and things like that were. So very quickly, we could have our sandbox system set up to be a match of what is in the production system to be able to enable rapid prototyping instead of having to go through and either rebuild an entire system or go through manually and update it so that it matched what was in a production system. So this enables that quicker ability to start getting good test scenarios or project type of scenarios together. From here we go to our data discard, which even right now is grayed out as a precaution that we don't accidentally go in and start deleting data. But the function of this piece is that this enables us to get close to creating a BW shell type of environment. So what customers would use this for typically would be if they wanted to put together a shell of a BW system with all the structures but none of the data. And so this enables us to go through and help clear out all of the master data, clear all the transaction data, and any other kind of miscellaneous junk that is back there in order to give a clean system to be able to start from. So now with that comes very great responsibility, and so that's why it's grayed out, because we need to be very careful with how we en masse delete data. So that's why normally it's grayed out, but in some circumstances when we want to do those kinds of system type creation or development, this would be a good use of that function. Okay, so all that being said about our non-data functions, now we're going to get into our main data function. So this is going to be it's called our data recast, and this is really what I would call the bread and butter of our system. And so what this does is it allows for us to take pieces of data, slices of data, if you will, from a productive system and move them into some other landscape. And so typically this is going to be moving to let's say a dev system or a sandbox system, which normally don't get refreshes, normally don't have very quality data in them, and normally we can't really do testing in them. And so what we're enabling users to do is to be able to get quality data from production, move it into dev, and then when you're doing your development, you can do testing at the same time, or testing scenarios at the same time. And so it allows us to really make very efficient use of a developer's time and of project time, instead of having to do all your development, move it to let's say QA in order to really get quality test data. We can do all of that testing in most cases in dev without having to transport it out and having to retransport or have another transport to fix something that didn't quite get fixed the first time. Or if there's a production issue, let's say we have a currency is suddenly failing for some reason in production in several finance cubes. What we could do is we could take, let's take those records from today. I'm going to take a slice of those records, bring them into my dev system, investigate what the problem is, see if I can figure it out, try some different ways of solving the problem, and I can do all that in dev without having to keep transporting something up and hoping that it's going to not break something or hoping that it fixes the issue. So that's where this solution comes into play, and I think is really valuable. There are a couple of ways that we can be able to produce these data slices or data snaps. One is through using the function called data snap. And the first thing we do in here is we select an info provider. So it could be a cube, a DSO, an SPO, anything that's a physical data store. We go to create. First thing that comes up here is display navigation attributes. I think this is a really nice function in that it allows you to select a set of data that may not actually even physically reside in the object. It may just be navigationally available to that object. So say a customer city or an employee, some sort of employee type or something like that may not actually be in a cube, but that we may want to segment the data by and be able to put together our slice by. So this allows us to have that flexibility in how we want to slice the data. It doesn't have to be just on like a date or something like that. It can really be, I mean, sky's the limit as long as it's a reportable type of field. So if you could create a BEX report and make it reportable, we can use that for a selection for our data. So now what we're going to see is a selection screen, and this is going to look very familiar to anybody who's used BW because it's going to essentially be the same looking screen as a list cube. So we've got all of these options for the types of data that we can select from this purchasing cube. We can use any or all of them, just depending on how you want to make that selection. Typically what I would tell a customer is you want to make a selection of data, in most cases, unless it's specific to a project or some other task. But for testing, we'd like to keep that data slice to be large enough to where you've got a good amount of records to test, but small enough to where it's manageable and not filling up your system. For example, if you've got a HANA box, there's no reason to bring 5 years of data in for testing in most cases. Or even if you did, maybe you bring in 5 years for one company code or one plant instead of bringing it in for everything, because you're just filling up space and you're not going to use all that test data, and you're paying for it. So grab a logical slice, bring it in, use it. When you're done with it, delete it. And that's what we're able to do with this solution. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go down and just select a couple of plants. So I'm going to do plant 90 and plant 92. And if I wanted to, I could go down and select a date, like a fiscal year period, calendar year month. In this case, I'm not going to. I'm just going to select that plant. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and save my scenario. And we'll just call this plant 90 and 92. Continue. So now that scenario is saved, and I can go back to it later if I want to by using Scenario Manager up here. And here it is. Here's my scenario that's saved. If I want to go back later and modify this and add another plant or add an additional date selection, I can do that as much as I want to, or even make a copy of this and change it, make it a little bit something different. I can do all of those things. Okay, but my next step I'm going to do is go to my export control. So export control is where I can create an export package for moving that data down into a file share. That is where all the Gold Client files are put, and that file share is shared across the systems that are connected to Gold Client. So that is how we share our data. So we'll start with our create export ID 262. I'll go into that export ID. I'm going to add a container, which is just selecting an info provider, really. And then I'm going to select my scenario that I created. The first one that always comes up is a full extract, scenario number 1. But in this case, we want that selection. We don't need everything. We just want a couple of plants. So I'm going to select my number 10 that I created. And I'm going to hit save. You'll notice in this case it shows record count 1. I've turned off the record count for right now. It's nice in some instances. Other ones where you're extracting large amounts of data, it's nice to not have to go through a record count where it's searching the cube and determining records. So I've turned it off in this case. It will get updated once we actually do the extract. So now we've saved our export, and so now once we have saved our export, we can add additional items to our export if we wanted to. If we wanted to add some master data, we could do that. Let's just say we wanted to add material. And we could add even another selection from the purchasing cube. We'll grab this one. Not sure if there's anything in it. No, nothing in this one. But we can add as many as we want to. Could be the same info provider, could be different info providers, could be master data, transaction data, doesn't really matter. We'll save this. And so what we see here is that this one doesn't have, it's showing yellow, it doesn't have any data in it at all. So I'll probably just delete this because there's no use having it in here. If we look over the master data, we see our attributes and texts are both checked. That means that we are going to bring over the attributes and the text for that particular master data item, which in most cases makes sense. So we would leave those as being checked. And if we are extracting both master and transaction data, best practice would always be that we would extract the master data first, then come back and do the transaction data. And so in that case, I already have material extracted, so I'm just going to select my transaction data. And I have the option of either executing in the foreground or I can schedule it in the background. If we're talking about a large volume of data, it's going to be better to schedule it in the background, otherwise it's going to time out. But for a small amount of data, which I know this is, we're just going to do an execute in the foreground. So once this export finishes, it will give us a message showing where that file was saved and then what the record count was. And there's our message. The record count's 14,867, and it shows us where directory where that file is saved at. So that then leads us to our target system, our BWT system. So I want to show you real quick what it currently looks like for that purchasing cube that we were extracting data from in the other system. I'm just going to manage here. All right, right now we see there's no loads, nothing there. And we see that there's an existing transformation, existing DTP, and an existing data source currently for this cube. If I am a business user, if I'm a BW analyst, I don't want anything to touch my existing things that I've created. I don't want it to mess up something. I don't want it to break something. I don't want it to screw up a delta. So I want to make sure that none of this is touched, and you're in luck because Gold Client does not touch any of that, and we'll see that in just a second. Gold Client actually creates its own data flow from the flat file data source, which will then flow up, create that new data source, create a new info package, create a transformation, create a DTP. And it'll do that in a new data flow, so it won't affect deltas, it's not going to affect anything existing, but it'll still load data as a request, which is a pretty useful, really useful tool. So in my target system now, we'll go to the same thing, my Gold BW, which is installed in every system that we want to use Gold Client with. I'm going to go down to my import control. And 262 is the export ID. Let's just confirm here. Okay, my purchasing, there's my 14,000 records, perfect. We see this box is checked called Generate DFC. This means generating data flow components. And the data flow components, again, are those transformations, the data source, the DTP. If we uncheck this box, right now the job won't work because we have not created that data flow yet. However, if we did this extract subsequently and maybe did different plants or something like that, we could leave the box unchecked and it would not rebuild all of those components necessarily. It would use what's already existing. This is really useful if you're working with a dev environment where things need to be collected into transports. The first time we run it, we would execute it in the foreground, collect each one of those objects into either a transport or locally, and then subsequent to that, we could run it in the background if we wanted to and load without having to generate data flow components and not being prompted for transports. So that's kind of the logic behind why we do that. In this case, I'm just going to execute the foreground because, again, this is a small amount of data. And if you watch down here, you'll see it building the data source. You'll see it creating the info package. You'll see it creating the transformation and the DTP. There's the PSA. So it's building all of these objects on the fly, and then after it's done building them all, it will actually execute the job to load the file from that flat file share, and then it'll load it all the way up using DTP into the purchasing cube. And there we go. Processed all 14,867. So now as we look at our vendor cube, we see that we've got our new transformation, our new data source, new info package, and new DTP as well. And if we look at the cube, we see that we have our request, and we should have all of our 14,867 records. Perfect. So now you can do testing. You can load this request to another object, open hub, doing some APD on it or some other analysis. Could be querying it, whatever you want to do. And then once you're done with it, it's as easy as selecting the request and deleting it. If in the future you ever wanted to load this again, or do testing over and over with the same package of data, That's not hard either because we can just go back and manage at the data source level and load it back using our DTP. So this is all using standard BW objects, standard BW data flows. There are no writing to backend tables or anything like that. It's all using the SAP existing architecture that is available in BW. And as soon as this loads, there it goes, available for reporting, and you're all set. You can use it again. So that is the main piece of what the Gold Client for BW solution brings. I'll show you one other piece that some of you may be interested in, and I'll go into more detail in it in another video. But transformation setup, data transform. So this is what we use if we want to do masking or blanking of data. So for example, it could be that you have a need to mask employee identification. So we would leave the employee number, so all those keys and things like that are intact, but we would remove the text, let's say, or the address or a social security number or something like that, or a credit card number we might scramble or we might remove entirely. So this is where that is done. You would select a rule to create. If we decided that we wanted to take a particular attribute for a master data object, like let's say plant, or text that we wanted to blank out, any of those we are able to go in, do the changes, and then when that master data is extracted within a transaction extract, it will go in and it will go against this transformation, and then it will use the logic that's defined here in order to blank out those fields on the export so that when that file is actually in the file share, it is in its transformed state with all that private information removed. So this is where you would go and do that. And that concludes our Gold Client for BW solution. I hope this was helpful for you, and look for additional videos a little more in depth on some of the other areas of the Gold Client for BW solution. Thank you for watching.